or good morning wherever you are in the world. I'm Samantha Joseph, and I'm moderating the second YouTube session of the sixth fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 15 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. We'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out about the Pixel Project by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. So far, we've managed to raise $565 towards our 5,000 USD goal. So we're off to a good start, and we're hoping that you guys can help us to reach our goal in time. So today, we're really lucky, and we have a very special guest today for our live Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session. So it's award-winning science fiction and horror author, Daryl Gregory. Hi, Daryl.
Hi, Sam. Hi, everybody.
So his most recent novel is Spoonbenders, a Nebula Locus and World Fantasy Award finalist. Other novels include Harrison Squared, After Party, Pandemonium, and the World Fantasy Award-winning short novel, We Are All Completely Fine. His stories are collected in Unpossible and Other Stories. Daryl has also generously donated one super exclusive critique session to the stash of author goodies that we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. The donor who donates to get this critique session will have 5,000 words of his, her, or their work in progress extensively critiqued by Daryl in writing via email. A chance to ask Daryl questions about the critique in one follow-up email. Just for all of you guys to know, Daryl teaches writing classes. If you are a fantasy author who doesn't live in the US or near anywhere Daryl holds workshops or classes in the near future, this is your golden opportunity to get honest professional feedback on your work. So this critique session is available to donors anywhere in the world, but you have to hurry up to donate to get it because Daryl only has one bundle available. So once someone snaps it up, it's gone. So please give generously. All the funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And if you're watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask Daryl questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Anusha, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me and I'll read it out for Daryl to answer. So now I'm going to hand it over to Daryl, who will be doing a reading.
Hi.
Hello, Daryl. Welcome to Read for Pixels. And could you tell us what you'll be reading for us today?
I'm going to be reading from the new novel that's in progress. I'm in the middle of editing it. We don't have a publication date, but it'll be coming out from Knopf sometime in about a year from now. And I will also take any feedback about titles. I'm in that terrible state where we have like 15 titles as a possibility, and we haven't picked one yet. So I'll be reading from the first chapter of what is sometimes called What the Thunder Said. Sometimes it's called Ghost Daddy. Sometimes it's called Untitled Appalachian Novel. Okay.
All excellent titles.
Yeah. So this is set in the 1930s and 40s in a part of Eastern Tennessee where my family, where all my ancestors came from. In fact, my family was kicked out of the Smoky Mountain National Park when they made it a national park in the 30s. So all the Gregorys were bought out by the government through eminent domain. And had to leave this area of the Smoky Mountain National Park called Cades Cove. You can still go to Cades Cove now and see Gregory Cave. We had our own custom cave. Gregory Bald, which was our mountain. But I wanted to write about what it was like to grow up in a really fundamentalist culture. And being a fantasy writer and a horror writer, I thought, well, what if the family's God that they were worshiping was real? What if they could reach out and touch it? What if it was there in the mountains? And talk about a woman who was raised to sort of be a revelator, be a person who was supposed to speak to the God, and kind of the abuse that happens to people who are sort of sucked into these systems when they're probably way too young to make a concrete decision about whether they want to participate or not. And certainly that's a thing that keeps happening in a lot of organized religions, and I wanted to talk about it here. So I'm just going to read a short section from the opening of the novel. It starts in 1933. Stella Wallace met her family's God when she was 9 years old. Decades later, she still didn't know why she didn't run that first time. It wasn't fear that pinned her to the spot, staring up at it, or even confusion. It was something else. Awe, maybe. Wonder so deep it was almost adoration. Pa said she'd been born in the Cove, but they'd left when she was too young to remember it. This is where her ma was born too, and where she'd come back to die when she got sick. This is where all the Birches had lived and died. He'd never told her much more about it than that. He was a quiet man, could go days on a dozen words, like a camel crossing a desert. They'd spent 6 hours together in the truck yesterday from Chattanooga, then another 3 this morning driving over from Maryville. And the whole time, the only one doing any talking was the truck, winding up the foothills, brakes complaining on the way down. Then the biggest climb to the top of Rich Mountain. At the gap, Pa pulled over into a gravel outlook. He poured water into the Ford's ticking radiator, then rolled himself a cigarette. Stella crept to the edge of the gravel and peered down at a valley spread out like a green pool. Is that it? Is that the Cove? Pa nodded. Where's Maudie's house? Her father squinted. Stupid question, she thought. Probably couldn't see it from here. She didn't expect him to answer, and then he pointed a cigarette at a high mountain to the east. Well, that's Thunderhead, and over there, the tip of the cigarette swung south, pointed at a high round bulge. That's Yorn. That's Birch Bald. My mountain, she thought. Not his. Maudie's is straight down from there. They followed the twisting road into a valley as bright and warm as a bowl of light. Pa pulled into a rutted lane, finally rolled to a stop in a grassy clearing in front of a white tin-roofed house. A short ways off to the side, a gray, unpainted barn sat askew as if leaning into a stiff wind. Her father stared at the house for a long minute, sighed, ran a hand through his black hair. A gray-haired woman came out on the porch, scrawny neck and thick arms in a no-color blouse, a long nose like a falcon. She held a tin can as if she just opened some beans. Pa said, well, got out of the truck, and Stella climbed out after him. The woman was old, older than anyone she'd ever met, deep wrinkles in that white hair cut short. She gestured for Stella to come forward. Stella glanced at her father, but his eyes were on the hills as if he were standing here alone. The old woman gripped Stella's chin, tipped her head sideways. You're a Birch, all right, meaning her long nose, a beak like the old woman's. Then she turned Stella's wrists and examined her palms. She ain't done hard work, if that's what you're wondering, Pa said. I kept her in school. The old woman grunted. Town girl. Pa said to Stella, you stay here. Maudie and I need a word. A word, close to her father's limit. The two of them went up the steps to the porch, then inside. After 10 minutes of fanning gnats from her face, Stella climbed the porch steps. Harsh voices stopped her at the screen door. They weren't in the front room, must have gone to the back of the house. She thought about sitting in the porch swing, but didn't want to make noise. She wanted to disappear. She went around the side of the house. Attached to the barn was an open shed, a roof nailed to the barn at the low end and angling upward to 2 posts like thick legs. A thick and multi-layered fence, wood rails and barbed wire, guarded an expanse of a churned up dirt, a muddy puddle, and an empty steel trough. Then she realized that the dark shade at the end of that roof was that in the dark shade of that roof was an enormous creature, a pig, unmoving, that looked as big as a hippo. She put her hands on the fence. Could it see her? Was it even alive? The beast moved, stepped out of the shade, staring at her. Hey, piggy, piggy. It answered her with a sound like a cough. She put her hand between the fence rail. Come here, piggy. Come here. It ran at her. She jumped back and its head slammed against the fence. She stumbled, fell back on her butt, and the animal looked at her for a long moment between the two lowest rails, its eyes even with hers. Then suddenly it turned aside, scraped its bristly hide against the wooden rails, ambled away from her. Stella got to her feet feeling stupid. It was behind a fence. What was she afraid of? I'm going to skip ahead to where she finds a shed sort of cut into the wood, into the clay of the mountain. She opens up a door and goes inside. The narrow room had been dug up into the hill. The wedge of light showed her rows of shelves along the clay walls, each shelf crowded with glass canning jars, some with food in them and some with what she thought was water. She reached up to the nearest of these, held it to the light. It was clear as air. There were so many shelves, so many jars, and sacks of other things on the floor. Cornmeal, yams and radishes, potatoes sprouting pale limbs. The air grew cooler the deeper she went. Then she felt something like a cold breath on her neck. It came from the back of the cellar. She crept forward, navigating by the feel of that feather of cold across her nose. At the rear of the room was a wall of rock, and leaning against it, an empty set of shelves with wooden backing, like a bookcase in the Chattanooga library. The bookcase was out of true, one end pulled out a few inches. Dank air whispered around the edges. She pulled it and was surprised when it swung toward her another 6 inches, pivoting like a door on smooth hinges. Behind it lay a ragged cave mouth, only 3 feet high. She recognized exactly what this was. She was a girl who read novels about castles. She'd been waiting to discover a secret passage her entire life. She glanced back at the cellar entrance, which seemed further away than she expected. Then she lay on her side and wriggled through the gap between the bookcase and the hole. Inside, her knee touched cold stone. The hole barely allowed any light. She was surrounded by darkness. The air smelled like a muddy riverbank. She got to her feet and put out a hand. Her fingers touched something cool and slick as toad skin, and she yanked her hand back, yet still she didn't leave. Her father would never find her here. He'd send for search parties and they'd comb the forest and never find this cave. Newspapers would print her picture. Years later, men would scratch their beards and say, well, I guess the Indians got her. She took another step and something in the air changed. A trembling, a thrum she felt in her chest. She looked around, eyes wide against the dark. And then she heard another sound penetrating through the thrum, a scrape like a knife caressing stone. Far above her, a gleam of moonlight fell like something like a china plate. She reached toward it, then froze. The pale, smooth surface belonged to something very large, and it had entered the room. She could see nothing, but she could feel it, a presence looming over her, looking down at her, listening to her breathe, listening to her heart pound. She couldn't move. The scrape came again. A chalky limb eased toward her. Something seized the back of her neck and she screamed. A hand gripped her jaw. How did you get in here? Her grandmother shouting in her face out of the dark, so furious. I'll end there. So that was the first time that Stella meets her God and her family's God that they've been worshiping for generations, and it goes on from there. So
I love your writing so much. It's so descriptive. Like when you're talking about when she's stuck in the cave and all that, you can feel it. I can't wait for your new book.
yeah,
So,
it's an area of the country I really love, and it's kind of going in those caves is kind of weird and it's creepy. Even though I don't believe in ghosts, but it's fun to write about.
Mike. Okay, so I'm gonna start the question, and you're actually really good about putting in characters like Stella, who she seems like she's going to be one of those characters that in your books that are like so complex and interesting, and and she just happens to be female.
Right.
So our questions for Daryl are going to be about the books that he's already written. So I'm going to start off now. Um, so your books feature very interesting female characters like Irene Telemachus from Spoonbenders and Aunt Rhonda from Devil's Alphabet, Lita Rose from After Party, and they're all complex characters with agency, but very human and flawed. So we just wanted to know, do you have any specific inspirations for your female characters?
Um, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, and I was raised by women, so I had a very strong mother, two sisters, no brothers. So my default mindset is to is that the is that it's populated by complex characters and complex women. My sister gave me a sweatshirt once that said, "Be careful, or I'll put you in my novel." They've. So one time I wrote a novel called "Raising Stony Mayhall" about a zombie, the politest zombie in the world, and who grows up in Iowa with three sisters, and I gave him three sisters so that my two sisters wouldn't be able to figure out which parts of each of them I put into each of the sisters. Um, so I did have, at one point in the novel, he says about the youngest sister saying, well, she was the most beautiful of the sisters. And my younger sister said, I knew that was me. And she wrote it, wrote in the text. Um, but I think that, I mean, as a cis white guy, a cis white het guy, uh, I get this question a lot, like, how do you? Because about half of my main characters in books and short stories have been women, and I get this question about, well, what do you have to do to write about women? And the answer really is to just to write from a point of humanity. It's I don't really. I think if you are sticking really close to what that character wants and needs moment by moment, it sort of pushes out cliches and genre tropes, because there's these terrible tropes that have happened in science fiction over the decades where you get these very two-dimensional female characters who may only exist to motivate a male character. Um, and that just doesn't hold up when you're being serious about the story and you're thinking from their point of view. I was a theater major, as well as I was an English and theater double major, which makes me twice as unemployable as the usual liberal arts major. And I got a lot of my lessons about writing come from acting classes and directing classes. And the point there is, when you're concentrating moment by moment to approach that character, even a character who's doing terrible things, but from a point of view of empathy, of trying to figure out what their point of view is. And if you can stay inside that, it protects you from writing a lot of bullshit, and writing a lot of things that are just genre conventions. You have to fight against that at every moment, and that's only being done by empathy.
Speaking of genre conventions, your female characters are generally flawed in some way, which is normal because they're people. But when you're writing these female characters, do you ever feel pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes, or even just the expectations of genre stereotypes to make them more likable or relatable? And do you get any flack for not making a female character likable enough?
um, no, in fact, it works better for me when, so I have this novel called After Party. The main character is a woman married to another woman. There's just enough near future science that they were able to conceive a child without having to use sperm at all. So they have a daughter. Uh, but she's really an unlikable person. She's had lots of tragedy in life, and she's very bitter. And I just found it tremendously fun to write someone that dark. and once again, it was like from her point of view. She's a very verbal, um, very acerbic person, and as you're writing, it's sort of she just sort of demands to be written that way. And so there is a problem. I think a lot of writers have hit this. We're saying in novels as opposed to short stories. In novels, there is, I think, more pressure to make someone likable because um, you're spending so much time with the character. There's none of that pressure in short stories. You can have a completely horrible person, but if the story is really well written, readers will follow you for that short amount of time. So there is a little pressure with novels, but the way out I found is not to worry about likability, um, but to bring the reader in enough so you know why they're doing what they're doing, what they're trying to what they're trying to do, and why they're doing it. Somebody said that we're every reader is happy to follow any villain as long as they're good at their job. If you can see why they're doing what they're doing and how they're trying to do what they're doing, we will follow along. We will watch anti-heroes like Nurse Jackie, even as she's stumbling and doing some terrible things, because we're so deeply into her point of view. And I think that's your only out. And so far, none of my editors have ever said, could you make them more likable? And I think it's because I actually write from a point of view of love. When I'm writing that character, I love that character. So I'm not writing down to them. I'm not punishing them. I'm just trying to figure out their story.
That
And
seems very commonsensical, right?
yeah, it seems so. It's just hard. I mean, I do things like, for example, when I had, I'm not a lesbian, so when I had a main character, I had gay friends of mine and women read the novel and say, "Look, can you feel like anything that seems like nope, that wouldn't happen. That's not the way it would go, or that's not the way they would think." And I'm happy for that, and I do that. So because the job of the writer is to imagine the other and include them in fiction, not to just write only about. I wouldn't be satisfied if I had to write only about, male white characters all the time. It would be kind of a terrible career, a terrible way to spend your time writing. But you do have to be thoughtful and empathic, and be willing to be open to feedback to your friends and fellow writers who can say, you try to gather readers who can be honest with you about your drafts and saying, no, I think you blew this. I think this is not, this would not happen.
Do you think that it's necessary to have sensitivity readers? People who
Yeah,
have
I think so.
experience with writing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, um, no, I think it's valuable. Uh, I haven't had an explicit sensitivity reader that I didn't go and find myself. I know writers who have had their editors go and say, "Look, you're writing about this subgroup. We're going to get a sensitivity reader just to flag anything that may be, problematic." Um, but I think if you're a good enough writer and you're trying really hard to write honestly, um, that's a valid thing to be doing. I think it's an important thing to be open to feedback, because um, I mean, my position as a guy who's been doing this for a while is I really want um, to not look stupid before it hits print. So I'm open to editors, beta readers, alpha readers, everybody. Just stop me from looking stupid. I want to write the most thoughtful thing I can. When I included a trans character in Spoonbenders, um, I had a trans friend of mine saying, "You know what? I would cut this line here. I think this is not accurate." I'm like, "Sounds good. That. Thank you for not letting me say this thing, which is maybe that character would not say then." So I'm happy for that stuff.
So the next question is about how women and characters like Irene and Aunt Rhonda, they go from being underestimated because they are women to becoming comfortable with their own gifts and powers. Do you think, how do you think stories that explore the theme that women can be flawed, human, yet powerful, and that men should respect women can help stop violence against women?
I missed some of that. It was a little echoey. So your question was the last part of the question was you, just repeat that one more time, and I'll try to grab it.
How do you think stories that explore these themes that women can be flawed, yet also human and also powerful, and how stories that include men respecting these women can help stop violence against women?
Yeah, well, this is a tricky thing, right? Because I've of two minds as a fiction writer. One, I want to write fiction where I'm taking responsibility for what I'm writing and write something that's truthful about people's experiences, um, both showing growth in, like, in, for example, Spoonbitter's Irene sort of comes into her own in the story. Um, and I like those kind of stories, and I like when a character gets to grow and find their own power. Um, and and I like showing both sides where they may have men in their lives who respect them, and show the flip side where you're saying, and here are some jerks in the story where they are not offering her respect. There's a scene in Spoonbenders where Irene, whose psychic power is to be able to tell when people are lying to her, just destroys a room full of people who are lying to her, especially the male bosses who are just lying to her in this interview. Um, so I like showing that. I thought it was a great moment for Irene. Um, but whether fiction can um, help stop violence against women, I don't know. The problem is that mostly what a writer can do, the most they can hope to do, is ask really good questions and try to tell the truth as much as possible. And you hope that that something that you write opens some eyes and makes people think differently. Um, but I also know that a lot of times people will, like, when I was growing up, my mom was really afraid of me playing Dungeons and Dragons, and she was sure that that was corrupting me. Um, and before there was D&D, there were comic books that were corrupting children, because these were low culture items, right? These are not what you're supposed to be reading. But before that, it was, penny novels, dime novels, that people thought were corrupting the youth. And it's weird. And so all those kind of trashy things, if that people labeled as trashy and as low culture, still ended up being things I read and you grow up reading. And lots of women are reading, like, I'm really pleased that uh, nieces are reading right now, Miss Marvel. I'm glad they're reading comic books. I'm glad for any kind of reading. Um, so I hope that opens minds, but I don't know if fiction can do it. I think the best thing writers can do is do stuff in the real world and try to help and take real action. In fiction, we can ask questions, we can try to entertain you, and we can try to open your minds. But I don't think if a writer tries to write a pamphlet or writes a sermon, it's going to work as fiction. I think it's a much more subtler thing. So I don't know, if if a novel can help reduce violence against women. I would hope so, but I don't know. I don't know if the science is there. So I don't know. It's a really tricky question, I think.
We have
So
a
the real point is to do stuff in the real world. Read your books. Try to write your books as a writer, but take action in the real world. Support items like uh, the Refunding of Violence Against Women Act. Vote for people who uh, who will take action against violence against women. Vote, support politicians who will keep pushing the Equal Rights Amendment. There are tons of real world things that are really important, and then there's writing these fanciful stories.
we have a question slash suggestion from one of the people watching, and it's from Misty306. And I think she's referring to your previous, your new novel. And she suggests, how about Appalachian Thunder for the title?
See, there we go. Yeah, I will forward that to my editor. The title, What the Thunder Said, comes from this verse in Revelations where this really freaked me out. So I grew up in a really fundamentalist background, Baptist background. My parents are probably really disappointed in me because I'm basically an atheist now. So they're disappointed. But I grew up reading a lot of the Bible, and there was this verse in Revelations about what the thunder said. And the thunder speaks. And John the Revelator, this guy who supposedly wrote Revelations, starts to write it down, and God says, "No, seal that up. No one shall ever know what the seven thunders say." And I was a science fiction reader, so I'm 10 years old, and I'm thinking, I know what the thunder said. It's God saying, "Look, there are aliens and other planets. We just can't tell you right now." So that sort of was the working title for a long time in the book.
Our next question is about motherhood. And so the idea of motherhood plays a role in some of your work. For example, the above mentioned Irene, as well as Jolene Whitehall and the other betas from the Devil's Alphabet.
Yeah.
So the first question is, sometimes motherhood isn't the wonderful, life-enhancing experience that culture keeps telling women it is. And you don't shy away from that aspect of being a woman, that mothers are also human and they do make mistakes. How do you strike that note of empathy and humanity when writing about mothers and their complicated relationship with motherhood?
No, that's an interesting question because so in for instance, After Party, that character I was talking about earlier, who's really acerbic, because she is technically insane because of this event that happens in the basically before the novel starts. She's afraid to ever become a mother and thinking she'd be better off with almost anyone else. I've been, committed to a hospital, and I'm not in control of my own hallucinations, and maybe I'm not fit to be a mother. For me, it's very easy to write because as a father, I was having all those same feelings. So it was just basically saying, I'm gonna take all my fears about being a good enough father and trying to do your best raising a child, and I'm going to also apply that to the mothers in the fiction. But there's also I try not to romanticize it too much, but I do have a soft spot for motherhoods as sort of a mother sort of being the heroes of my fiction. It keeps coming back in my books. In my first novel, Pandemonium, the most solid character, the most level-headed character is the mother of this family. In Raising Stony Mayhall, it's also the mother who sort of holds everybody together and who has the moral fiber that sort of she's the rock that holds the whole family together in the face of all kinds of tribulations. So that tends to I try not to romanticize it, but I know I have this soft spot. I think it's because of the way I was raised. I just see my mom worked a lot of hours and raised us. My dad worked a lot of hours too, but my family was sort of traditional in that my mom, I think, was doing twice the work to raise us. So I know I have that soft spot. And I don't know if I'm answering that person's question. So feel free to ask a follow-up and we can zero in more on what they want to ask.
Well, the next question we have is, it's related to motherhood and also, I suppose, it's sort of science fiction. So, in a lot of examples that in a lot of characters that you have, or books, stories that you have, a father isn't present within the relationship dynamics of a family, and sometimes they're not even present in the making of it. So, in a
Right.
lot of yeah, in the impregnation. In a lot of theory, the height of feminism is reproduction without men. So do you think that this situation might actually mitigate a lot of sexism in the dynamics of traditional heterosexual relationships that
Right.
sometimes end up with women facing domestic and sexual violence from a male partner, and the fact that she is in a family always complicates that situation?
What was the last part of the question again?
Um, do you think that this situation without with the the men not being part of the impregnating and having
Right.
children might mitigate a lot of sexism in the dynamics of traditional heterosexual relationships that
Yeah.
sometimes end up, yeah. What do
Um,
you
eh, well, certainly in my fiction, it changes the dynamic. I mean, um, one exercise that I think is good for writers, and I do this myself, and I learned this from Samuel R. Delany, who was one of my early teachers. Um,
Mm,
uh, a fantastic writer, but also a thoughtful guy and one of the first people of color in science fiction, one of the first openly gay men in science fiction, and one of my first professors. I went to Clarion uh, many decades ago, back in 1988. Um, and his technique was saying, for your characters, see what happens when you flip the gender, and see if that exposes any cliches, any genre conventions that you're falling into. So if you have a situation where you say, look, what would happen, and this is true in Devil's Alphabet, and this is true in After Party, where you would not need men to create children. Does that change something? Does it change about the dynamics? And I think it does. Um, um, Certainly, Irene in Spoonbenders is raising her son basically by herself. There are men who are trying to hang in there, but her husband just bailed on her and vanished. Um, uh, but now that I think of it, it's like, I do have a tremendous number of novels where the fathers are missing and gone, um, and basically women raising the families by themselves. So I'm not sure what that says um, about me. Well,
the author being um, analyzed through his work. Okay, well, the next question is about your male characters.
yeah,
So your male protagonist characters don't follow the alpha male tropes in Spoonbenders, Devil's Alphabet, and Pandemonium, and they are comfortable with recognizing and respecting women who are wiser, more powerful, and maybe or more intelligent than they are. So
right.
the first related question is: did you decide to craft the male-female relationships in your books in this way on purpose, or was it a subconscious part of the way you handle the development of relationships in your writing?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think both are true. I mean, I think ideas come to you and they match sort of where you are subconsciously. But also, there's such a cliche of the male chosen one who's the most important
Mhm.
figure. I really like characters who, and male characters too, to show them that there are male characters who are in relationship with other people, and really their happiness depends on connection, not being the lone hero, not being the chosen one. And I'm really, and this may be subconscious as well, but um, I'm really attracted to stories where not about the coolest guy in the room, but the guy next to the coolest guy in the room. So I have a lot of characters who are my male characters tend to be sidekicks who have seen are next to some person who is doing something amazing, but they're not the point of view character. My other guy is the point of view character, and I think that comes from wanting to tell stories that don't bowl straight down the middle of genre convention. Um, I've never seen myself as those guys. Um, but I like these guys off to the side who are trying to make things work with lots of other people. My experience of the world is always about being in relationship with other people. Um, so I don't, I just find those people, the chosen ones, the coolest guy in the room, to be less believable. There's something about me that I just don't believe them as much. So it's a combination of subconscious, but also looking at the genre and saying, is there some other way to go here? Is there some different way of taking this where we're not telling the same old story over and over again?
We have a we have a comment from one of the people watching, and the recovering zombie says that In The Devil's Alphabet, the father-son relationship dynamic was really complicated and very well written. Um, where did you get that dynamic from? What was your
Um, yeah, so that was me and my dad, I guess, and me and my mom. Um, the father is a preacher, and the son has fallen by the wayside, and they have real trouble communicating. So me and my dad, like the very uh traditional way we communicated for a long time is I just thought we couldn't really express emotions with each other directly. And so in that book, he's having real trouble connecting. And I said to my editor, I said, there'll be no point in this book where they say, I love you. They're just almost incapable of expressing honest emotion. They just have never been that vulnerable with each other. Um, the great thing about what's happened in my life is that my father, as he aged, and as I got more mature, and as I aged, we got more and more vulnerable with each other, and we could say that to each other, and it's been the greatest gift. My dad has become, this very um, much more soft-hearted person than he was when he was younger, and that let me be more soft-hearted and vulnerable to each other. So that's been a real gift. And so it's a complicated relationship. They love each other but can't express it. And that's what I was trying to get at with in that novel.
related to that? Do you think that reframing how stories describe men, moving away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability, can be one of the ways science fiction and fantasy writers can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women? What do you
Oh
think?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the job as writers, especially with dealing with women, well, male writers, especially writing about women, writing about people of other classes, other ethnicities, all that stuff. There's an opportunity in literature to write about the other as carefully as possible and and much more thoughtfully. And the interesting thing is that um, there was a right wing element coming into science fiction a few years ago who tried to hijack the Hugos. I won't even mention that group's name. I don't want to give them any airtime, but it was terrible. And they were so afraid that someone was taking away their old style science fiction, that somehow their childhood was being damaged by people writing much more complex narratives about all kinds of people. And it always struck me as a very odd thing that to be nervous about complexity, because science fiction is all about what if, what next, what could it be. And we have books with uh, three or four genders. We have books with really we've had for decades, we've had Ursula K. Le Guin, Samuel R. Delany, Philip Jose Farmer. You've had all this experimentation about all the different ways that relationships can work. That's just in the 60s. And since that time, we go through the new wave, and we go through the explosion of diversity that we have right now in science fiction. We have a huge number of ways to express complexity and to say that the world is not so simple. And the great lesson of science fiction is that that is a better science fiction novel than some received trope about this is the way the future is going to proceed. There's going to be the Roman Empire in space. That's dead. We've seen that 1,000 times. There's nowhere to go with that. So that's your way out, new writers of science fiction, is to embrace the complexity and to embrace not only complexity of social structures and to question everything that's sort of received, um, uh, but to also question um, on a relationship level, go deeper about your own relationships and about your own marriages or romantic relationships or your friendships, and right into the complexity, and you'll end up with a better, more believable science fiction novel. Um, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's sort of my way out. Is if lean into the weird, lean into the complexity as much as you can.
The next question isn't a reflection of your writing, but it is a situation that turns up in a lot of science fiction and fantasy books. So the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in science fiction and fantasy books. Do you think that this is an issue that SFF writers have started tackling successfully in recent years?
Certainly, I mean, certainly science fiction lately, if you've been reading the award winners, it's a much more complex environment, and and those issues of consent are, if are being handled much more competently than they are now. And um, when coercion is an issue, it's not simply a plot element as much as it's being handled. It has ramifications. It has after effects. So there's nothing you can't show in science fiction, especially stuff that happens as commonly as violence against women happens in the real world. It's a mistake to not have it in your fiction if the story calls for it, but it is a huge mistake if you don't deal with the ramifications of this. If it's just a plot element, so. And as far as coercion, I think the error that had been happening in for decades in all literature, but especially genre fiction, is that um, by not by not thinking more thoughtfully about the point of view of female characters, some crazy stuff was just dismissed in fiction. You can read Heinlein and just wonder, has he met any women
Right.
who uh, who are thinking a little more complexly about it? Like, I won't even get into all the very rapey kind of things that happen in Heinlein. There's a lot of certainly in some older fantasy too. There's some very odd things that may also come out of romance, which is like, I'll just win her over by kissing her harder. That's just ridiculous. And I think this is because they weren't thinking hard enough about real people and real women. Instead, they were writing out of received tropes and cliches to make their plot work. So, yeah.
Right. Well, um, the next question continues talking about the science fiction culture, and I suppose it's called geek culture. And so, in general, this sort of geek culture related to science fiction and fantasy
Right.
has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male dominated, despite a rising number of prominent, well respected, and well known female authors. So, what do you think needs to be done to make geek culture and science fiction and fantasy as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for
Right.
women and also girls?
Yeah, uh, yeah, I mean, between Gamergate and what's been happening with comics, and then what
Mhm.
happened in science fiction with that group I shall not name, but in general, um, the amount of abuse that's been heaped on women and people of color, the queer community, it's kind of stunning the amount of fear that's being expressed, like they're losing their science fiction or they're losing their comics. It's really hard to understand, and I think and I'm not sure what the right thing to do is. One thing that science fiction has been doing really well in our community is we talk about it a lot, and I think we're talking about it more honestly. You certainly see in the Nebulas and Hugos a huge, a great diversity in who's being nominated and who's winning those awards. So the readership is changing. The community is changing. Um, and one thing I take hope from is that even though the trolls are very loud, the community itself is really resilient, and we stand up for our own, and so I think I think science fiction and genre communities, we do have a problem, but I've been really impressed by how strongly the community has fought back, and I think it's just a matter of um, one, talking about it more, two, being really explicit about biases that have existed in our field for years. Um, and to point out that stuff. Um, and I know as as a older white guy, um, it can't the speaking out and the conversation cannot just be coming from the people who were left out of the conversation earlier. It has to come from people like me too. You have to appear on things like this. You have to talk online. You just can't support what's going on because you have to realize that their voices of the alt right and the Gamergate folks, um, um, I hope, will be drowned out by the people who are, um, who represent our community's actual values.
Right. Yeah, that's another point. So people like you, people in the public eye, they can speak out and call these trolls to accountability. How do you think people like your fans or just normal science fiction fantasy convention goers, people who are just part of the community, what can they do to call trolls to account if they witness these things happening?
One, don't give them oxygen. Um, um, ban them from your feed. Um, and and also, not pick up your glass and politely walk away. Be part of the conversation. But I must admit that I think because of the political environment in the United States, and that some of the stuff that was happening in social media and Twitter, it was getting in the way of me getting any writing done and thinking clearly. Like there used to be, um, there was more separation between writing time and engaging with folks, and I realized that, especially when a certain person was elected, we were all up in arms, and we just wanted to um, uh, we continued to be upset, and so I realized this wasn't healthy for my writing, and it wasn't healthy for me. And so I'd also encourage folks to maybe figure that out for themselves too. It's like choose the times that you want to engage and choose the times that you want to withdraw and take care of yourself and take care of your community. You um, I basically dropped off of Facebook, um, and I go to Twitter much less often than I used to, kind of as a self-care kind of thing. Like it wasn't helping me get writing done, um, and I thought maybe I could speak more clearly through my fiction, um, and be more thoughtful if I take some time away from this stuff. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm not good at preaching, and I'm not good at knowing what the right thing to do is, except for take care of yourself and take care of each other. Um, and uh, and I'm confident though that there's enough of us that we'll get through the trolls. At least that's my religious belief.
We have a very interesting question from one of the viewers. This is from Misty306. So her question is, do you believe if more Caucasian males read books by people of color and non-binary writers, that an understanding could be reached?
Um, well, yeah. Well, this goes back to that earlier point was saying, you hope so. I mean, you hope that people reading more widely would open their minds a little bit and let a little light in and a little empathy. Because the whole joy of science fiction is reading about the other. It could be different. That's the whole lesson. So I hope so. But I wouldn't bank money on it, because I know that like when Frank Zappa was testifying before the Senate, he says, well, if music could really control people, then most songs are love songs, so everybody would be falling in love, and they're obviously not. So I don't know how much straight fiction can do. I shouldn't say straight fiction, but I don't know how much just pure fiction can do. I hope it changes something. Certainly, books change my mind and open my mind, but it doesn't replace the real work of doing stuff in the real world and and uh, and getting to know other people different from yourself. So I don't know. I don't know why I'm such a skeptic about the ability of fiction to change minds, but I would love for there to be good evidence that I'm completely wrong, that the right book just open up minds. I said to somebody the other day, I'm like, the reason why I'm a little bit skeptical is there are people who I know are who are absolute jerks online who love some of the same books I do, and that offended me. I'm like, how could you read John Crowley's Little Big and also be this jerk? It offended me, but it's possible. It's like, okay, I guess it didn't change them as much as I felt it changed me.
Fair enough. Parental relationships play a big role in your book. So we can see that parents are usually the most influential role models in a person's life. Yourself as a dad and also a teacher, what do you think parents can do to help prevent violence against women and girls in future generations, and also to get the boys involved in helping to do so?
Um, yeah, I took parenting. My kids are grown now, uh, uh, but I have nieces and nephews, and I have my girlfriend's daughters are 10 and 12. Um, I take that stuff really seriously, um, and you know, me and my partner, we tried to raise our kids in a really open environment to the point where I remember once when my son was really young, he was about 6 years old, and it was before gay marriage was legal, and we were trying to explain this to him, and he burst into tears because he thought our friends Connie and Peggy were going to have to break up because he thought and he
Oh,
thought yeah he thought it's like he'd always grown up with people um, of he'd grown up with people who were gay. He'd grown up with people in committed relationships. He'd grown up with all these different models, um, and he just thought that's the way the world should work. It was a great gift. I felt kind of sad when he found out that, like, no, the world actually was a little meaner than he thought. Um, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know the best way to do it, but you just try to one raise kids in as to express as clearly as you can that there are many ways to be in the world, um, and you hope it takes. You really do. I know friends who um, their kids have struggled with schizophrenia and depression, and there are some things that just come out in the wiring that make it much tougher to raise children. But you just try to do your best, and so there's this tug of war between nature and nurture. But you try to rig the game as much as you can on the nurture side, by modeling whatever behaviors you want to see in them, and you just hope it takes. Every time we made a tragic error, we're like, well, we're not sure how this is going. My partner and I would say, well, let's put another quarter in the therapy jar. They'll have to figure this out later. We probably did this wrong, and you just try to try again and do better.
I think that's what everyone is doing, right? They're just trying to be the best they can.
It's really hard. It's really hard. And then we've kind of people of my generation have already screwed up the planet for my grandkids' generation whenever the grandkids show up. So we'll also have to apologize a lot.
Hey, final question, Daryl. Um, you have been really, really supportive of our Rico Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women's work as a whole. Could you tell us why you support the cause to end violence against women and decided to help us?
Um, well, first of all, it's alarming to me that we still have to keep having these conversations. But it's really clear that in the current political environment, um, that we have to stay vigilant. We have to vote for the right people. We have to support organizations that are trying to do the right thing. It's, uh, an alien visiting this planet would say, let me get this straight. You have to have a charity organization that is protesting violence against 51% of your population, and we'd have to say, yeah, that's a problem for us. It's crazy from a science fictional point of view that we even have to do this. Um, but here in the real world, uh, we have to do what we can. I don't know what else we can do. So I think it's a responsibility just as a human being. I don't care if you're male, female, gay, straight, non-binary, any ethnicity. Um, this is a we deserve a we deserve better than this. We deserve this better, not only as a guy who wants to have a better place for my daughter and any of those future grandchildren, uh, but for my son too. He deserves to live in a world um, where whoever he chooses to partner with is not living in fear. So if he chooses to have a female partner, that's just um, it's so dead obvious. I'm not even sure how we're supposed to how to respond and how we're supposed to explain things to our alien overlords when they arrive.
Fair enough. Um, okay, we have a final question from one of the viewers, and I'd like to know which of your books, besides Spoon Benders, should we read first?
Oh, okay. This is easy. So the shortest book I have is called "We're All Completely Fine." So that's like the amuse bouche. That's the appetizer to draw you into the rest of my books. So yeah, I would go for "We're All Completely Fine." It's short. Everybody's got a couple days to read a novella. It's half the size of a normal novel. So I would start there. Or on my webpage, you can read a novelette, Nine Last Days on Planet Earth, which is just a novelette, like I think it's like 12,000 words, short story that you can read for free on Tor.com. And if you like that, keep going. I'd love to have you read more.
That was our last question, Daryl.
Okay,
So
Sam.
thank you so much for doing this question and answer session with us. And thank you everyone for participating and being awesome viewers. So Daryl, I'm going to put myself on the screen, but please don't leave. After this, I'm going
Okay.
to ask you if there's anything that you want to announce or talk about, and then I'll put you back on screen.
Okay.
So for now, I'm going to be on screen, everyone. Bye, Daryl. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, hi everyone. It's me again. So I just wanted to remind everyone that Daryl has generously donated one super exclusive critique session to the stash of author goodies that we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So the donor who donates to get this critique session will have 5,000 words of his, her, or their work in progress extensively critiqued by Daryl in writing, and a chance to ask Daryl questions about the critique in one follow-up email. So uh, again, Daryl teaches writing classes, and if you're a fantasy author who doesn't live in the US or near anywhere that Daryl holds workshops or classes in the near future, this is your golden opportunity to get honest professional feedback on your work. So please give generously. All funds go towards Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. So we also have plenty more author goodies available from authors including Alison Goodman, Hilary Monahan, and Sarah Langan. Plus, this week is Brit Week, so if you fancy goodies from some of the best British science fiction and fantasy authors, you're in for a treat, as we have all sorts of perks from Anna Smith Spark, Adrian Tchaikovsky, Juliet E. McKenna, Jen Williams, and Richard K. Morgan, ready for donors as well. So new goodies will be released every week throughout September. We also have a special auction featuring some rare books from the horror maestro, Stephen Graham Jones. Books that are so rare you won't even get them on eBay, okay? So please give generously and help us to reach our goal. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. I'm going to share a slide that will help you guys, uh, direct you guys to where you can go help donate. Once again. So here it is. This slide has all the information if you want to donate to us. You can donate to get these goodies on Rally Up at http r for p Rally Up 2019. You can bid for Stephen Graham Jones books on Rally Up at http /SJG Charity Auction 2019. If you want to learn more about Read for Pixels, go to http Read for Pixels. And to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.pixelproject.net. So Daryl, is there any announcements that you want to make? Anything you want to talk about before we end this session?
Well, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, I'll be doing the CIFO reading series in Seattle at the Wild Rover. You can, I'll post something online about that, and it's on Twitter. And then I'll be appearing in Portland on Thursday. That's with Jack Skillingstead, and Ted Chang will also be reading. Brenda Cooper hosts that in Seattle, and Mark Neiman Ross hosts it in Portland. So come on down Tuesday and Thursday. And then after that, I'll be teaching at Viable Paradise. I encourage people to, if you're a new writer, to apply to workshops like Viable Paradise and the Clarion. I've taught at both those. I recommend them all highly.
Thank you so much, Daryl.
Thanks.
So we're going to leave now. And thanks everyone for participating. Have a great day. Bye.
Thanks.